Thank you so much for coming to my talk. It's called Reframing Shame and Embracing Mistakes. My name is Jameson Hampton. My friends call me Jamie, and we're all friends, so you can call me Jamie. You can find me on Twitter at JamieBash. Feel free to find me. We can be friends. You can tweet about my talk if you want. Just please keep in mind that I use they, them pronouns, so if you're talking about me on the internet, thank you for remembering that. Let's do an exercise. Raise your hand if you've ever introduced a bug into production or caused an incident. Okay, yes, lots of hands. I was going to say, this isn't me teaching you how to raise your hand. This is me raising my hand. This is a talk about shame. And shame is a really powerful emotion. It runs deeper than other similar emotions like embarrassment or guilt, which are primarily concerned usually with something that you've done or perhaps something that you haven't done, as the case may be. Whereas shame is primarily concerned with like who you are as a person, and that allows it to do damage to our self-worth in a much more insidious way. The second part of the exercise is to raise your hand if you lied just now about if you'd done an incident or not, or if you thought about lying like you weren't sure. Everybody, hands in this room went straight up, so. But the reason that it occurs to people like I should lie about that is because shame makes it hard to admit when we've made mistakes, like both to each other and also to ourselves. Which is a shame because we learn a lot from mistakes. We've been doing it for our entire life. From when we were in childhood, you try things, you see how it goes, you learn from it and you try again. And everybody does it. A former coworker of mine, sometimes when I was feeling like self-conscious about making mistakes or not knowing something, would tell me like, no one is born knowing this. Like Ruby was invented by a guy in Japan who wasn't born knowing it either, and neither were any of us. So of course you have to learn it. Another very wise person once told me that wisdom is knowledge and understanding and experience. And if you don't have all three of those things on a topic, then you don't really have wisdom about it yet. So if you haven't really experienced it, and a lot of that type of experience comes in the form of making mistakes, then you don't really have wisdom about it yet. I have a case study about an incident that I kind of want to talk about. Some of you might remember this was the GitLab outage in January of 2017, and I will talk about what happened to kind of set the scene about why I was impressed that they were doing like a good job at blamelessness. They had an outage where they had about 18 hours of downtime. They lost about 300 gigs of production data that ended up being completely unrecoverable. It was caused by an error made by a developer. They called him team member 1 in all of their correspondence after to like not, put the blame onto someone. Actually, he did later come out and admit like openly who it was, so it's not a secret, but I'm using team member 1 here. And what happened is he accidentally removed the primary database directory instead of the secondary, and that's what kicked off this whole incident. I really love this quote. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the responses at the time, but they said, at GitLab, we think that the people making the most mistakes frequently correlate with the people doing the most work, which I think is both true and wise to say. I remember at the time a lot of people in the community speculating about team member 1 and if he would get fired, because that's what people say. They're like, oh, who's going to get fired for this? Actually, team member 1 was promoted not long after the incident. He had qualified for a promotion to senior dev based on the GitLab career ladder just before the outage, and they correctly, in my opinion, decided that making one mistake didn't change everything else that he had accomplished, and so he was promoted not long after. In fact, I couldn't find the exact quote, but I remember very distinctly folks at GitLab responding to questions about who was going to get fired by saying things like, why would we fire him now? He just learned this. He's never going to do that again. They also had these shirts made for all of their engineers who worked on the incident. I love I'm team member 1. I think that's very good. There's one person who pressed a button one time and then became weirdly famous for one specific incident, but in reality it's on the whole team that A, there were no guardrails in place to prevent it from happening, and also B, it wouldn't have been nearly so bad if they had viable backups, but they hadn't tested their backup procedure, which was part of the problem, and that's something that's on the whole team. But ultimately, the reason I'm talking about the GitLab incident is because, after you learn from mistakes, you also have to talk about them. And in the original exercise, it can be hard to admit when we've made a mistake, even though again, everyone makes them, so if you claim that you've made no mistakes ever, you just sound like a liar to everyone. This is a quote from my friend Carrie Miller, who many of you may know. A junior engineer is just a senior engineer who hasn't broken production yet. And that kind of leads into what I mean about talking about mistakes. Because if you talk about your own mistakes, that like normalizes it for other people too. And this is particularly important for senior developers, because naturally, people who are more junior are more afraid to like openly and publicly admit when they've made mistakes. They feel like it reflects on them, even if it doesn't. And it's common, like I remember when I was very junior, to feeling like senior folks like know everything and don't make any mistakes, which obviously isn't true. So I think it's really important to show like people who are new to the community that like everybody makes mistakes. It also makes you a good teammate to like, you know, take responsibility when you've messed up. That ensures that it doesn't fall on other people. It also means that your team can band together faster to resolve mistakes faster because you're being like honest about it. And perhaps counterintuitively, it inspires confidence in your work because it shows that you know when you're wrong and you can admit it and you won't lie about it. Of course, this all kind of assumes that you're in a healthy workplace. Naturally, in like very unhealthy workplaces, there can be like consequences to talking about mistakes in this way. That's just going to force everyone to adopt like unhealthy communication strategies, which is why like a culture of this is very important. A culture of transparency in particular. Another thing I remember speculating about back in 2017 was like what was going to happen to GitLab as a whole company. They were pretty new to the scene at the time. This kind of outage and data loss is like pretty bad, and I kind of thought this incident might kill GitLab as a company completely, and I was bummed because I liked using GitLab. But they put out this postmortem. Maybe you can see it's kind of small, but this is a 21-minute read on Medium, so it's extensive. And I learned a lot from it, both about like what happened and technical stuff, and also about like how to talk about mistakes. I think this is one of the best examples of like a public postmortem that other people can kind of like learn from still. This quote's kind of long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's with someone from GitLab talking about like the effect on developers, like when you're a tech company and developers are your users. And that's interesting to me because it kind of gets at a combination of factors. The first one is that I think developers tend to be more sympathetic when incidents are happening because like we've all been there and we know that it sucks. I hope that that in turn can maybe make us more sympathetic to ourselves when it's happening to us because again, we know other people have also been there. They know that it sucks too. But also just the idea that being honest and open about incidents actually fosters a lot of trust. And so the public postmortem at GitLab, I think, proved, A, that they took the problem seriously, B, they were being honest about what was going on and where they were, which makes them more trustworthy in the future when they say that things are going on. You can like believe that that's probably true. And also like that they're taking real steps so that it doesn't happen again. So I think that was like a kind of great factor of things that like really helped while they were dealing with this. I know I was just talking about why the word shame is like troublesome. And now I'm immediately talking about like the concept of a wall of shame, but hear me out, I have an anecdote. So before I was in tech, I worked in television production. I used to be a manager for a local public access station. I was a news anchor, and I was also in charge of all of our on-air personalities. And we had a wall of shame at our station, and anything that went like majorly wrong at the station would go on the wall of shame. This was normally on-air anchors saying something wrong or silly when we were live. But even though it used the word shame, which in retrospect I'm not too fond of, the culture around it at my studio wasn't about punishing people. It was about humor. The wall of shame was funny because it had lots of funny things on it, and so people liked to read the wall of shame and like reminisce and chuckle about it because it was stuff like, January 15th, the teleprompter was not updated to reflect changes to the order of anchors. And Jamie reads, and now back to you, Jamie, on live television. And because everyone felt positively about the wall of shame, it kind of became like a rite of passage to be put on the wall. And then when you said something wrong on TV, instead of getting like flustered and embarrassed in that moment, it was more like, well, guess this is gonna look good on the wall of shame. I'm not necessarily suggesting a wall of shame specifically. I can see lots of ways that that could go wrong if like not everyone's on the same page about it. But I think the underlying message here is about like creating a culture where making mistakes is just something that everyone does and we can laugh about it. And then that removes the stigma that causes people to like have a lot of big feelings about their mistakes. Also, obviously, one step up from quiz shaming is dog shaming. The idea of combating shame with humor is something I try to bring to my own life, because if I can make jokes about my own mistakes, that makes them feel different to me in my brain. And like I was saying earlier, I think it's really important for more senior folks to be transparent about their mistakes. But it's legitimately very hard, especially if you're still suffering from imposter syndrome feelings, even when you are senior, which is still very common, particularly with underrepresented folks. And so for me, kind of making it into a joke is a way to make myself feel safe about sharing information that otherwise might make me feel very vulnerable. I do think there's something worth saying about self-deprecation, though, because like too much self-deprecation, even as jokes, is like, it can be harmful to the psyche. So I try not to make jokes about myself that are too mean. It's not about being mean to myself. It's about normalizing the act of talking about stuff. I'm not going to read out all of my Twitter jokes because this is a tech talk and not stand-up comedy, but if you've been reading them, you'll see that they're not too mean. They're pretty good-natured. So while there could be a really good talk about how to foster this kind of culture at like an organization, that's not always something that people can really do on the individual level. And so this talk is kind of more about fostering that kind of kindness to yourself. And I'm going to talk about some of the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy. Particularly some of the aspects I find particularly relevant to like imposter syndrome and work anxieties. Automatic thoughts, feedback loops, cognitive distortions, and cognitive reframing. Caveat, like I'm not a psychologist or anything. I'm not an expert in CBT in any meaningful way. It's just something that I've been using myself for my own anxiety for a long time, and I find it helpful, so I like to share it with other people when I can. Automatic thoughts is kind of like one of the real core basics of CBT. The idea that a lot of the thoughts we have are just happening to us without us really thinking them through. Our brains are very complex, and they're very practiced at interpreting things around us, so they can form these really complex thoughts without us realizing. Sometimes this is great. Like, if you're in a dangerous situation, you don't have to have a whole internal debate about what you're going to do. You can just remove yourself from that dangerous situation because your brain reacts to it automatically. Other times, though, having a bunch of thoughts rolling around in your head that are based on the automatic mind rather than like actual reasoning can be like really unhelpful. The phrase intrusive thoughts gets thrown around a lot. Often that means like violent thoughts, but it doesn't have to. Cognitive distortions, I'm going to talk about at like kind of length at the end of this talk, but this is the idea that like there are harmful thought patterns that you can get stuck in. On a base level, just like, have you ever met someone and jumped to a conclusion about them, and then like it wasn't true, and then you felt bad that that was the first thing that you thought? We can't really help having those kind of automatic thoughts, even when they don't reflect how we actually feel about stuff, because that's kind of just how our brains are wired to have thoughts. And so if you realize how many of the thoughts that we have every day come from our automatic brain, that can be like really helpful in mitigating it. Because, of course, having thoughts about your feelings leads you to have more thoughts and more feelings. In CBT, there's the idea of the ABC model of emotions, which means that an activating situation triggers a belief or a thought, which then leads to a consequence or a feeling. The activating situation itself doesn't inherently carry any emotional weight. Like it might be, I'm stuck in traffic. There's not any emotional weight inherent to being stuck in traffic, but then you're thinking like, oh, I'm gonna be late, I'm gonna get in trouble. It like leads your thoughts to like have these certain, like end up at these certain feelings at the end of it. And that's why negative feelings are so prone to like breeding more negative feelings. I experience this a lot in the form of secondary anxiety, which in my opinion is a really dumb form of anxiety that I get, where like I get really upset that I'm already feeling anxious. And it's like, I don't want to have a panic attack. Oh, I hope I don't have a panic attack. Oh my God, what if I have a panic attack? And then like, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's more likely to happen. Also, like bad feelings, we feel them in our bodies, not just in our brains. These are just some, particularly with panic, that I've experienced. But ultimately, like, when you feel bad in your body, it's natural to trigger like more bad feelings. And so it just feeds into this idea of like getting stuck in loops. So cognitive distortions, again, that's like kind of the actual thought patterns that cause this. The theory of cognitive distortions was proposed in the 60s and 70s by a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck. Then his student, David Burns, who also said this quote, which I really like, popularized the common names of some of the distortions in the 80s, which I'm gonna, like the last whole section of my talk is talking about those. But the more you practice having harmful thought patterns, and you're practicing them every time you allow yourself to have them without like stopping and correcting it, the more entrenched they become in the way you think, and the more automatic they become. Cognitive reframing is the name of the CBT technique for like stopping this in its tracks, essentially, where reframing just means like looking at a situation from a different angle. And the more you practice it, the more automatic that becomes instead, because your brain kind of remembers the shapes of these thought patterns. So if you're always doing negative ones, then it comes more naturally to do negative ones in the future. But if you're practicing doing positive ones, it will become more naturally over time to think positively. So I've used the word practice a bunch of times. Okay, but how do I actually practice that? I have some steps. First, you have to notice your cognitive distortions when you're having them, which unfortunately also requires practice. If you can't tell when you're like having harmful thinking, it's impossible to stop doing it. So this step is really important. But the good news is once you're aware of some of the different types of cognitive distortions you might be having, which I'll go over, then it helps you to recognize when they're happening to you, although it is still hard. Once you notice that you're doing it, you have to evaluate the evidence. I find it helpful to like actually physically write it down. Try like having one column of evidence that suggests that your negative thought is correct, and then a second column that like proves that it's not correct. I find that writing stuff down is very helpful because your brain sometimes tells you negative things very loudly. And if your brain is being very loud at you, you can still look down at a physical list that you've written and like get something out of it. And you have to practice compassion to yourself. I try to think of this in terms of if someone was treating one of my friends the way I'm treating myself right now, how would that make me feel? And normally the answer is I would feel bad about it. Don't treat my friends that way. So that's like how kindly I would like to train myself to treat myself also. This is kind of like that theory that if you fake smiling enough, the act of smiling will like eventually positively influence you anyway. Speaking kindly to yourself is kind of the same. Even if you don't believe the kind things you're saying when you start doing it, if you keep doing it, it will positively affect you. Another thing that's important is, when you're thinking critically about your thoughts and your feelings is being able to name those feelings, which is deceptively hard. This is the feelings wheel. I'm sure it's way too small for you to read, but most of you have probably seen it before, and that can be helpful into putting a specific name to the way you're feeling. I have a limited amount of time in this talk, and this is a huge topic, so instead of spending a lot of time on it, I recommend the best talk I've ever seen about feelings is Hacking Your Emotional API by John Sowers, who's here. Please, everyone, watch it. It's really great. So that's your homework. But I had to save the last part of my session to talk about like all of these different individual types of cognitive distortions. This isn't an exhaustive list. I've chosen some to talk about here that I think have like particular relevance to some of the negative feelings that are often common in the workplace and ones that feed into imposter syndrome. So I'm going to talk about all of these, actually. All right, so all or nothing thinking. This is the idea that like you have this assumption that there's only two possibilities or outcomes in a situation. There's no middle ground, there's no mistakes, there's no gray area. So what might a thought, an all or nothing type thought at work look like? I made a mistake today, my performance review is next week, now there's no way that I'm gonna get a good review. Okay, well, what would it look like if we took that thought and tried to reframe it to be more positive? Yes, making a mistake is frustrating. The timing on this one was really frustrating, but I just have to keep doing my best. It's unlikely that a single mistake is going to ruin my whole performance review. In a lot of my reframing, I like to try and name the feeling. Like I'm going to get a bad review isn't an emotion. I'm feeling frustrated about it is an emotion. And it can be really helpful to like pinpoint where you're coming from and really helpful to like reframe things in a helpful way. Catastrophizing. I do this one a lot. Extrapolating that the worst case scenario is going to come to pass over like even something small or insignificant. Oh, I caused an incident at work today. Oh my God, now I'm going to get fired. And oh my God, then I'm never going to be able to find another job anywhere. Let's try reframing that. You know, actually, once I think about it, I wouldn't expect to get fired over just a single incident. But even if I did, I found this job, and I know that I would find another opportunity. Your mileage may vary with this one, but like with worst case scenario thoughts, I like to, instead of being like, there's no way that'll ever happen, like that doesn't really make me feel better because my mind is like, but what if it does? So I like to think about like, well, what if the worst case scenario that I'm fearing right now did happen? Like, usually it's not actually the end of the world. Fortune telling, making dramatic predictions about what's going to happen in the future, particularly non-evidence-based predictions. Last time I did a deploy, it brought our whole site down, and I have to deploy again today, and I'm just sure it's going to happen again. Okay, let's reframe that. I did mess up last time, but I learned a lot from it when that happened. I'm better prepared not to mess up again now. I just need to take it one step at a time. Labeling, an overgeneralization that creates a negative judgment about a whole person. Actually, it doesn't have to be a person. It could be a group of people, or a thing, or a concept, or really anything. But in the context of imposter syndrome in this talk, I'm kind of assuming that you might be labeling things about yourself. And so that's the nuance I'm taking when I think about it. I overlooked a really obvious bug today. I am just terrible. I'm just a terrible programmer. Let's reframe it. Yes, I made a mistake today. I missed a bug. It felt really obvious to me in retrospect. I'm feeling pretty embarrassed about it, naming the feeling. But now I'll know to look out for that kind of stuff next time. Hopefully I won't overlook the same kind of bug again. Magnifying the negative. I think this is another one that people do a lot. Fixating one's thoughts on only the negative parts of a situation, becoming hyper-focused on the negative parts. This allows negative feelings to become exaggerated, and that's how you kind of get into feedback loops. Jess found 2 typos in my code when she reviewed it today. It must seem to her like I wasn't paying any attention to this at all. Well, let's reframe that. The rest of my code was good. Typos really aren't that serious of a mistake when I think about it. Jess caught them in code review. That's what code review is for. And it didn't end up being a big deal. The other side of this is minimizing the positive. And because when you're so focused on what went wrong, it's super easy to forget about what went right or like ignore the value of it. Even though these sound kind of the same, they manifest in pretty different ways. My manager complimented me on fixing that bug today, but I don't know, it was pretty easy. I think anyone could have done it. She was probably just trying to be nice to me. This one's easy to reframe, actually. I did great today. My contributions are valuable to the team, and that's why my manager wants me to be aware of it. Just trying to be nice is a phrase that's like one of my banes personally. I'm always like, oh, I don't know, what if my friends don't really like me? They're just trying to be nice. Because like the reason that you'd want to be nice to someone is usually because you like them. You want them to feel good about themselves and their contributions. So these are kind of 2 sides of the same coin, and that's the coin that causes this extremely relatable feeling. I can certainly relate. Mind reading is kind of an interesting one because like we do read into what other people are thinking. That's like, we should. It's part of communicating with people. But when you read too far into it, or when you assume that you're right, even though you don't really know what they're thinking or the background of it, like that's when it can become kind of harmful. Ugh, David left so many comments on my last PR. He must think I'm really stupid. Let's reframe that. I feel self-conscious, naming the feeling. I feel self-conscious about the fact that David had so many suggestions, but I know he's trying to help me improve. He's complimented my work before. I'm sure he doesn't think I'm stupid. And this one's actually, I sent this to my coworker, David, and he confirmed that he doesn't think I'm stupid, so that one's a success. Overgeneralizations. broad conclusions with only little evidence. This is why, if you have one bad experience, maybe you're just assuming that it's always going to be that bad. Ugh, I got asked to do a demo. It never goes well. I always mess it up. Never and always are big overgeneralization words. That's kind of how you can tell that's what you're doing. I do get nervous doing demos. I have struggled with them in the past, but this time I have a chance to make sure that I'm prepared. I used the phrase self-fulfilling prophecy earlier, and I think that it's really important to think about the fact that if you go into a situation already having negative feelings about it, it's much more likely to go wrong. So it's really important to try and reframe your thoughts to be more positive, even if you're not really feeling that positive about it, because then you're more likely to manifest good and successful outcomes. Self-blaming is also a particularly big one in my opinion. It's kind of why I did the whole case study about team member 1. Because we often believe that we're solely responsible for something that goes wrong. But it's very rare in tech, actually, that any one person is solely responsible for really any situation that happens. Ugh, a bug I introduced caused our entire app to crash. It's completely my fault. Let's reframe. Well, actually, even though I wrote the code that introduced this bug, my coworkers did also test it, and they did also approve it when they didn't catch it either. It's not all on me. We succeed or fail as a team. I think if everyone internalized this idea of succeeding or failing as a team, maybe we'd be a lot kinder to each other and maybe to ourselves in general. In conclusion, I know I made some of this stuff sound pretty simple, but actually it's really hard. It's hard to even make the decision to examine your thoughts in the way that we just spent a half hour doing. And all of you made that decision when you decided to come to my talk, so thank you. I like CBT in that it's simple to understand, even if it's not simple to implement always. And once you understand it, you can start putting it into practice and practicing it. But changing the way you think is hard. I talked about those mental roots that we've got entrenched in our brains. You are going to mess it up. I mess it up all the time. But the good news is that it's additive. The more you practice it, the better you will get over time. Even if you mess it up once or twice or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times or any number of times, it's still additive when you do it and when you get it right. And remember, I'm proud of you and of all of your mistakes. Everything that you've accomplished, all of the mistakes you've ever made, and everything that you've learned from them are all part of the you that you are right now, and I think that's pretty great. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for choosing to come to this talk. I want to thank RubyConf for inviting me to talk about this kind of stuff. I think it's really important and under-talked about in our industry. I hope that even one of you found it helpful. It's been helpful for me, and so that's why I wanted to share it with all of you. Find me online, find me at the conference. I want to be friends with everyone. Thank you so much.